Book 2, Chapter 2, Bonfire at the Place des Grives. When Pierre Gringore arrived at the Place des Grives, he was stiff with cold. As he was crossing the Pont des Mineurs to avoid the crowd on the Pont au Change, the mills owned by the Bishop of Paris had splashed him as he passed, and his coat was soaking wet. He hurried toward the bonfire blazing magnificently in the middle of the square, but it was surrounded by a dense crowd. "Damned Parisians!" he said to himself, for Gringore, like a true dramatic poet, was given to soliloquies. "Damned Parisians!" he said to himself, for Gringore, like a true dramatic poet, was given to soliloquies. "There they are, cutting me off from the fire now, and I really need some heat, too. My shoes leak, and all those blasted mills showered water on me. May the devil take the Bishop of Paris and his mills. I'd like to know what a bishop needs a mill for. Does he expect to turn miller some day? If all he needs for that is my curse, I give it to him gladly, and to his cathedral, and to his mills. No use expecting any of these idle fools to stand aside. What are they doing that's so fascinating, anyway? Warming themselves. What of a fine pleasure. Staring at burning logs. Ha! What a magnificent sight! On looking more closely, he saw that the circle of people around the bonfire was too wide to allow them to warm themselves by it, and that it was not only the sight of burning logs which had attracted them. A young girl was dancing in the large space left open between the crowd and the fire. As soon as he saw her, Gringore was so dazzled and entranced by her that for a moment he could not decide whether she was a human being, a fairy, or an angel. She was not tall, although the graceful lines of her slender figure made her seem to be so. Her coloring was dark, but it was easy to see that in the daylight her skin probably had the beautiful golden luster of Andalusian and Roman women. She was dancing and whirling on an old Persian carpet carelessly spread out on the pavement. Her large black eyes flashed fire. All eyes were fixed on her. All mouths hung open. As she danced to the rhythm of the tambourine which her round, delicate arms held over her head, she seemed to be some sort of supernatural creature, with her billowy, multicolored dress, her bare shoulders, her shapely legs, which her skirt revealed from time to time, her jet-black hair and her fiery eyes. "She's a nymph, a goddess," thought Gringore. Just then a strand of the goddess's hair came loose, and a brass coin which had been attached to it fell to the pavement. "No, she's not a goddess," he said to himself. "She's a gypsy." The illusion vanished. She began to dance again. She picked up 2 swords, balanced them by the point, and made them turn in one direction while she turned in the other. No doubt about it, she was a gypsy. But although the spell was broken, the scene was still not without charm and fascination for Gringore. The bonfire threw a raw, red, flickering light on the faces of the onlookers, and, at the edges of the square, cast a dim glow mingled with their wavering shadows against the ancient black facade of the Maison aux Pillars on one side and the stone arm of the gibbet on the other. Among the countless faces tinged scarlet by the light of the flames, there was one which seemed more absorbed in the contemplation of the dancer than all the others. It was a man's face, austere, calm and somber. The crowd surrounding him made it impossible to see what kind of clothes he was wearing. He did not seem to be more than 35 years old, but he was almost totally bald, with only a few tufts of thin hair, already gray at the temples. His broad, high forehead was beginning to be furrowed with wrinkles, but extraordinary youthfulness and ardor flashed from his deep-set eyes. He followed the nimble young gypsy girl's every movement, and as she danced and capered to the pleasure of the crowd, his reverie seemed to grow more and more gloomy. The girl finally stopped, out of breath. The people applauded warmly. "Come here, Djali," she said. A pretty little white goat, which had till then been lying on one corner of the carpet watching its mistress dance, stood up and came over to her. It was an alert, glossy animal with gilded horns and hooves and a gilded collar around its neck. "It's your turn now, Djali," said the girl, sitting down and gracefully holding out her tambourine in front of the goat. "What month is it, Djali?" The goat struck the tambourine once with its hoof. It was, in fact, the first month of the year. The crowd applauded. "Djali," she said, turning the tambourine a different way. "What day of the month is it?" The goat raised its hoof and tapped the tambourine 6 times. "Djali," she went on, with still another movement of the tambourine. "What time is it?" Djali tapped 7 times. At the same moment, the clock of the Maison à Pilleurs struck 7. The people were amazed. "There's witchcraft in that," said a sullen voice from the crowd. It was that of the bald man, who had not taken his eyes off the gypsy girl for an instant. She shuddered and turned away, but a burst of applause covered the sinister remark. She put it out of her mind and continued questioning her goat. "Djali, how does Master Grichard Grand Remy, captain of the Paris Pistoliers, walk in the Candlemas procession?" The goat stood up on its hind legs and began to bleat and walk with such comic dignity that the entire circle of spectators burst out laughing at the parody of the captain's hypocritical piety. "Now, Djali," said the girl, emboldened by her increasing success, "Master Jacques Charmilou, the king's attorney in the ecclesiastical court, show us how he preaches." The goat sat down on its rump and began shaking its 4 feet in such an odd way that, except for his bad French and worse Latin, it was Jacques Charmilou in the flesh. The people applauded even more enthusiastically. "Sacrilege! Profanation!" cried out the bald man. The gypsy girl turned to look at him. "It's that nasty man again," she said, and pushed over her lower lip into a little pout. Then she turned on her heel and began to take up a collection in her tambourine. Coins of all denominations rained into it. All at once Grigori saw her passing in front of him. Noticing that he had absent-mindedly put his hand into his pocket, she stopped. "Damnation!" exclaimed the poet, as the hand he had plunged into his pocket touched reality. Nothing. Meanwhile, the pretty girl was standing before him, looking at him with her big eyes, holding out her tambourine and waiting. He began to sweat. If all the gold in Peru had been in his pocket, he would have given it to her. but no gold of any kind was there, and, besides, America had not yet been discovered. Fortunately, an unexpected incident came to his rescue.
"Go away, you gypsy wench!"
cried a shrill voice which came from the darkest corner of the square. The girl turned around, frightened. It was not the bald man's voice this time. It was a woman's voice, pious and malicious. The exclamation which had frightened the girl delighted a band of children who were roaming nearby.
"There's the recluse in Roland Tower screeching about something. Ha ha ha!" they shouted, laughing. "Maybe she hasn't had any supper."
Meanwhile, Grigori took advantage of the girl's agitation to slip away unnoticed. The children's shouted remark reminded him that he had had no supper either. It is a serious thing to go to sleep without supper. It is even less amusing to have no supper and not know where to sleep. This was Grigori's situation. He felt necessity pressing in on him harshly from all sides. He was absorbed in melancholy reflections on his destiny when a strange but remarkably sweet song burst into his reverie. The gypsy girl was singing. Her voice was like her dancing and her beauty. It had something indefinable and charming about it, something pure and ethereal. She was singing in a language which Grigori did not know and which she herself seemed not to understand, for the expression with which she sang the words had little relation to their meaning. Thus she sang these words with wild gaiety.
Un canfre de gran riqueza jalarán dentro un pilar. Dentro de nuevas banderas con figuras de espantar.
And an instant later, the way she sang the following lines made tears come into Grigori's eyes.
Alarapes de caballo, sin poderse menear, con espadas y los cuellos, ballestas de buen echar.
But her voice exuded joy above all. She seemed to sing like a bird from sheer light-heartedness. Grigori listened, spellbound. It was the first time in several hours that he'd been able to forget his suffering. But the moment was short. The same woman's voice which had interrupted the girl's dancing now interrupted her singing.
"Stop that chirping, cricket from hell!"
The cricket stopped short. Grigori put his hands over his ears. "Silence, you blasted screech-owl!" he cried out angrily. The crowd began to mutter their agreement, and the invisible interpreter might have had cause to regret her attacks on the gypsy girl if their attention had not been diverted at that moment by the procession of the Pope of Fools, which, after parading through a number of the streets of the city, had just entered the Place des Grèves with all its torches and turmoil. From the time it had left the Palace of Justice, it had been joined along the way by all the vagabonds and unemployed thieves of Paris, so that it had swelled so impressive size by the time it reached the Place des Grèves. At the head of the procession marched the Egyptians, as the gypsies were called in those days. First came the Duke of Egypt on horseback, with his counts walking beside him. Behind him were all the other gypsies, men and women, carrying their bawling children over their shoulders. All of them, including the Duke and the Counts, were in rags and tatters. Next came the kingdom of slang, all the thieves and robbers of France. The king of Slang, surrounded by his unruly subjects, rode crouched in a small cart drawn by 2 enormous dogs. After the kingdom of Slang came the Empire of Galilee. The Emperor of Galilee marched majestically in his purple robe stained with wine, preceded by his court jesters and surrounded by his mace-bearers and subordinate officials. Lastly came the clerks, carrying flowered-decked maypoles and large yellow candles, wearing their black robes and marching to music that was worthy of a witch's Sabbath. In the center of this crowd, the high officers of the Brotherhood of Fools carried a litter adorned with more candles than the shrine of Saint Guinevere in the time of plague. On the litter, decked out with all the symbols of his office, was the new Pope of Fools, the bell ringer of Notre Dame, Quasimodo the Hunchback. It is difficult to give an idea of the look of proud satisfaction which had come over Quasimodo's sad and hideous face during the journey from the Palace of Justice to the Place des Grèves. It was the first feeling of pride he had ever known. Until then he had known only humiliation, scorn for his condition, and disgust for his person. Now, therefore, despite his deafness, he enjoyed, like a real pope, the cheers of that crowd whom he hated in order to feel himself hated by them. He took seriously all their ironic applause and mock respect, in which, however, it must be added, there was also a certain amount of genuine fear. For, although a hunchback, he was strong. Although bow-legged, he was agile. Although deaf, he was malicious. 3 qualities which temper ridicule. But it is doubtful that the new Pope of Fools had any clear awareness of either his own feelings or those he aroused in the people around him. The mind which was lodged in that blighted body necessarily had a certain incompleteness, and deafness also. What he felt at that moment was, therefore, vague and confused. Joy and pride alone penetrated his consciousness and shone in his dark, misshapen face. It was therefore not without surprise and alarm that, just as he was passing before the Maison Haute Pileuse in that state of semi-intoxication, the crowd saw a man rush up to him and angrily snatch away from him the gilded wooden crosier, the symbol of his mock papacy. It was the bald man who, a short while before, had chilled the poor gypsy girl's blood with his words of menace and hatred. He was wearing an ecclesiastical robe. Just as he came out from among the crowd, Grigori, who had not noticed him till then, recognized him. "Why, it's Dom Claude Frollo, the archdeacon!" he exclaimed. "What the devil is he doing to that one-eyed monster? He'll get himself eaten up!" The crowd shrieked with terror as the formidable Quasimodo leapt down from the litter, and the women hid their eyes in order not to see the archdeacon torn to pieces. But Quasimodo came up to the priest, looked at him, and fell to his knees. The priest broke his crosier, pulled off his tiara, and ripped his tinsel-covered robe. Quasimodo remained on his knees, lowered his head, and clasped his hands together. They then began a strange dialogue of signs and gestures, neither one of them speaking, the priest standing, angry, threatening, and imperious, Quasimodo kneeling, humble and supplicating. Yet there was no doubt that Quasimodo could have crushed the priest with his thumb. The archdeacon finally shook Quasimodo's powerful shoulder and motioned him to stand up and follow him. Quasimodo stood up. The Brotherhood of Fools, recovered from their first stupefaction, now moved forward to defend their pope, who had been so abruptly dethroned. Quasimodo placed himself before the priest, clenched his mighty fists, glared at them, and snarled like an angry tiger. The priest resumed his sombre gravity, made a sign to Quasimodo, and withdrew in silence. Quasimodo walked in front of him, scattering the people from his path. When they had gone through the crowd and across the square, a number of curious people decided to follow them. Quasimodo then took up the rear guard and walked backward behind the archdeacon, squat, massive, monstrous, shaggy, growling like a wild beast, and producing large waves in the crowd with a gesture or a look. They both disappeared down a dark, narrow street. No one dared follow them into it. The mere thought of Quasimodo's threatening snarls was enough to keep everyone back. "An amazing incident," said Grigori to himself. "But where the devil am I going to get something to eat?"